Really excited for this panel. I'm Chris Neidl. I'm the Impact Director for Rethinking Removals and a proud board member of the DAC Coalition. And once upon a time, I got my undergraduate degree in geography, so very excited about today's discussion. Our panelists have already been introduced on our way in, but really excited to have some real leading thinkers and doers in the CDR and direct air capture space. But what I thought I would do just real quickly to set up the subject is kind of lay out some key ideas, and then we'll get into the conversation. The first is that I think it's been sort of alluded to indirectly a lot, is that the question of where DAC goes is very much at the core for a lot of people of what DAC is. I think a lot of people's exposure to direct air capture immediately is the idea of where are they going to put these things. So it's not an incidental matter when we think about direct air capture in terms of how it's conceived. And there are a few things I think that I'd like to get in today as we discuss, are a few aspects of siting and geography of DAC that I think we're going to want to talk through. One is that the matter of where DAC actually happens in the world is a function of many different dimensions that interact with each other, not just one. And this includes certainly the physical conditions of a place, which sometimes, to a fault, I think is what we focus on, is where is it optimal to do DAC based on the access to energy and proximity to storage, et cetera. But there's obviously incredibly important social elements as well that also come into play about anywhere where a DAC facility or any supporting infrastructure is proposed is, what is it like in that place? What's the local history? What are the local politics? What are the issues of most concern? And how can benefits actually be quantified or harms for that local community is incredibly important. And then obviously the economic and commercial aspects of it, just the project economics. Different places have different favorable characteristics in terms of the cost of building and operating direct air capture. And some places are already endowed with relevant sectors and businesses that can actually directly help deliver DAC. And then lastly are the political economic factors, obviously, which are going to drive where DAC goes. And so that's everything from, are there existing policies already in a place that are either directly or indirectly paving the way for direct air capture? Are there certain places where it's easier for money to flow for a whole host of reasons, capital, than others? Does that become a way that opens up and closes down DAC siting? And then how does CDR and direct air capture specifically already fit into existing legislation or targets in a particular place? If one place has a net zero law already on the books that references carbon removal, that is obviously a much more conducive condition than a place where those same policies don't exist. So we'll talk through those today as elements of geography, but I would also say two final quick points is that it also really matters of what we're talking about when we're talking about direct air capture. I think that the reference point that many people have mean one thing, large, utility scale direct air capture. But we know now as this sector continues to expand and diversify, there's many different forms that DAC takes, including more distributed forms. And then also importantly is that a lot of the DAC discussion is focused on international and national policy. And I think when we talk about where you put something, that's where lower level, subnational, and local government really matter, and policy. So we're going to talk through those. James, can you hear us? Give us a nod or say something if you're, there we go. Excellent, great. So
really loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly, James, thanks. So what I thought we could start off with is, and what I'm really excited is we have just on this small panel, we have very different folks that are coming from very different contexts. Dr. Buck has studied CDR and DAC globally and is focused a lot on the United States. And then we have James and Andrew are able to speak about the East African and specifically Kenyan context. So that's a great point of contrast for the discussion. So what I thought I would start with, though, is with you, Dr. Buck, is what I just laid out in terms of the dimensions that really drive where siting is going to happen, physical, logistical benefits, policy, social acceptance. And as someone who studies very closely this issue of DAC siting, particularly within the US context, I wonder if you could try to characterize a little bit about which factors here in the US, and maybe you could take the DAC hubs as a point of reference, are really sort of driving or dictating most where siting is going to become. where it will happen?
Yeah, so I think right now what we see is a lot of the combination you mentioned, policy. So for example, Wyoming, very proactive in terms of pre-permitting some of pipeline corridors, that kind of infrastructure. I think geology, obviously very important. And speaking about the DAC hubs, that's actually a particular opportunity to think a bit more sophisticated about how we think about siting. You know, they have certain criteria they laid out in merit review, where they could pick, but there is some opportunity to focus on energy communities. So communities that are suffering from the transition, maybe having displaced fossil fuel jobs. And I think that going forward, we need to take a worker first kind of perspective. But I think with energy transition more broadly, we need kind of a desire first framework. And what I mean by that is, it's not so much thinking as a developer, where can we put these things on a map, but going to communities, asking them, what sort of opportunities would you like in this energy transition? What can you picture here? Can you picture advanced biofuels or green hydrogen or DAC? And familiarizing them with these different sorts of opportunities to find that fit, and starting from that as a point of departure.
Yeah, do you see that job there obviously could be done by the DAC companies and on the commercial side, but there's probably a role for government or other entities that are founded around the public interest to play that role as well? And I'm wondering, like, what might that look like specifically to do that well, to query communities about whether they want it or not in order to make that decision?
Yeah, this is a huge gap. I'm not trying to suggest something that I think is easy. It requires a real sea change about how we think about the problem, and putting resources into what might be seen sometimes as the soft side in terms of engagement, education, workforce, like Jack mentioned a minute ago. And so I do think that there's local and regional economic development authorities that already do some of this amount of stuff, but they're just not familiar necessarily with all of these technologies that we're talking about. So I think philanthropy, universities, governments at different scales all have a big role to play here.
Absolutely. Well, we'll come back to the U.S. In the course of the conversation, but let's turn to East Africa and Kenya specifically, because I was just in Nairobi with Andrew and some of his colleagues for Africa Climate Week, and the way in which carbon removal more broadly and direct air capture specifically are talked about there, and the types of issues and opportunities and tension, in many ways it's almost like the inversion of what we see in the United States or in the North. And so what I thought, I know no one better than James to sort of articulate the case for direct air capture in Kenya. And I wonder if we could, James, is just sort of go one by one over those dimensions that I listed up top, and you could sort of specifically talk about, characterize what they look like in the Kenyan and East African context. And so just to start off is with, if you could sort of summarize the physical endowments or resource endowments that Kenya and East Africa more broadly enjoy that make it such a favorable location for direct air capture and storage.
Sure, Chris. I think the first thing to start with is, of course, what makes East Africa particularly attractive is it's home to, this amazing geological feature, the Great Rift Valley. Not only that, but it's a part of the Rift Valley that's quite active, is well endowed with geothermal energy resource. It often surprises people to hear just how much of Kenya's energy is derived from geothermal sources. We derive about a third of our electricity from geothermal, actually maybe a bit more than that. But importantly, we've barely scratched the surface. There are tens of gigawatts of untapped geothermal potential in the East African Rift Valley. But that's not all. By virtue of being, in Kenya, there's a range of other renewable resources, ranging from, some hydro that's already on stream, really high quality wind, some of the highest quality wind, terrestrial wind in the world. And of course, we are on the equator and not very cloudy. You can guess how much solar potential the country has. And as a result, it's not surprising that Kenya's grid is upwards of 92% renewable already today. The real problem is how do we bring more demand onto that grid in order to allow for the development of this massive potential renewable energy supply.
And then enormous storage potential as well in basalt permanent storage, which is a rarity.
Indeed. Yeah. Indeed, right? As with Iceland, where the porous basalt in Iceland's geothermal zones has proven fantastic for mineralization, East Africa is also richly endowed with similar basalts and has that coincidence of large amounts of untapped renewable energy and the basalt you need in order to do mineralization, which of course is one of the most stable ways to store CO2 once it's captured permanently underground, in a situation where there aren't that many other competing decarbonization uses for that energy. There's lots of places in the world that do have untapped renewable energy potential, but a lot of them tend to be in close proximity to grids or other energy uses that are rich in emissions. And it probably stands to reason that there's a bit of a trade-off between using renewable energy to drive back versus using it to accelerate the shutdown of high emissions energy sources, which we just don't face in Kenya by virtue of the composition of our grid.
Yeah, and I wonder if this is relevant, again, as a point of contrast between East Africa and most other parts of the world, is the argument that you've made many times, which I think is having an impact on how the body politic in Kenya is looking at this opportunity as well, is that a positive relationship between energy access and direct air capture, which is the opposite of the way that it's often talked about here, where there's a scarcity and a competition between that. I was wondering if you could just sketch that out a little bit for us.
Yeah, it goes to the point I made about demand, right? Kenya and indeed most of Africa is generally regarded as energy poor. We need energy access both for domestic kind of basic lifestyle use as well as for industry and job creation. And yet we have all of this untapped renewable energy literally waiting. There are gigawatts worth of pending developed projects in a queue waiting for offtake agreements from the national utility. And the challenge that the utility has is it's trying to ramp up basically on the back of the growing demand of the domestic consumer, which is growing, but it's growing at the rate that the economy is growing. In order to go ahead of that, in order to build faster, in order to kind of go as quickly as our natural resources would allow, what we are lacking is big bankable energy demand, right? Some large industries that can come in and commit to taking, gigawatt hours, if not terawatt hours of power every year, if it is available. If that kind of demand existed, it would create an incentive for developers to just bring everything on stream, knowing that they had demand on the back end. And once you're building at scale, the overall costs of the energy in the system come down. We are a subscale system, which means everything costs more. Actually going up to scale lowers the cost of energy, even for the purposes of energy access. And by creating inflows of investment into the country, also create those rising incomes that will allow our own consumers to become more bankable as retail users themselves. So there's a virtuous cycle here that begins with find those loads, those dispatchable loads that you can attract to a place like Kenya and use to basically underwrite massive investments in unlocking, literally hundreds of gigawatts of renewable energy potential that the country has across the different sources that I mentioned earlier.
So it's, in short, DAC is an enabler of energy access rather than something that renewable energy is diverted to that you have to fight over in a scarce way. So that is, again,
exactly.
for anybody sitting in the room here who is working on DAC, that is again, almost an exact inversion of the way that we often think about it or talk about it in the discourse in the United States. Andrew, I wonder if what I was impressed by in Nairobi during African Climate Week is how high of a level interest in carbon dioxide removal and direct air capture had gotten, largely because of James and some of his colleagues' advocacy, that you had the president talking about carbon removal directly in a supportive way. And I wonder, as someone who has enormous experience in the political realm in Kenya, working on climate, environment, and other things, if you could sort of characterize what is the logic, do you think, politically in Kenya for supporting carbon dioxide removal? What's the source of the enthusiasm beyond James's eloquence?
Thanks, Chris. I think part of the issue is this, and James has outlined it very clearly. Now, what people don't understand is, and I see it sometimes with people say, oh, but renewable energy is so cheap, why isn't it being scaled up in Africa? Where you find last year, I think 2% of all investment on solar went to Africa, despite 50% of all solar irradiation having taking place in Africa. Because the utility is your counterpart, the cost of capital is 5-6 times higher than you would find it here in the US. So, people are having to spend a lot of money just financing small-scale projects, whether it's wind, solar, geothermal. The second part is, yes, we have a surplus of energy in the day from renewables. The problem is, the way our demand cycle looks is, for example, Kenya has a daytime demand of something like 2.3 gigawatts in the day, and then 800 at night. But you're still paying for the full installed capacity. So for every gigawatt, you're paying a little bit more. So if we have carbon capture, mechanical engineered carbon capture, you can use that at night. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is because the companies are international companies and they're more bankable, they're able to attract cheaper capital. So from a political point of view, of course it makes a lot of sense, because you're going to reduce the cost of electricity to the general public, not only for access, because access is just one part of the story, but for other commercial uses. For example, milling of maize, irrigation, and stuff like that. So you tend to reduce the cost of living, and for any political system, if you can reduce the cost of living, especially in this atmosphere that is there now, you're a sure winner in political way.
James, would you add anything to that? Because you were obviously doing the hard work of socializing this idea with the president's office, but if you had to put yourself in the president's shoes and some of his ministers, how would you characterize what the rationale or the strategy that's emerging in Kenya is, beyond what Andrew just described to us?
I think Andrew nailed it. I think the additional things I would add is, as you may have seen, Chris, and you were there for the climate summit, as were we all, Kenya is trying to articulate this vision of climate positive growth as a narrative for the country and for the continent, where we're saying the way that we get to middle income status is actually by increasing the global carbon budget rather than detracting from it, and attracting investments and technologies and activities that allow us to really do that in the fullness of time. Now, part of that is everything that's been talked. There's the direct benefits to the economy, there's the positional benefit, and there's the ability, particularly in the case of DAC, to get Kenya early in this potentially burgeoning major new industry. Just the fact that young Kenyan engineers and scientists and so on are getting exposed relatively early in this technology increases the chances that we can start to build, beyond kind of addressing basic livelihood needs of Kenyans, start to give young, ambitious Kenyans a pathway to globally competitive jobs and hopefully an emerging and evolving industry. That's already began to happen. As I don't need to mention, we have DAC innovators starting to kind of explore and experiment in the country. And that also creates an interesting dynamic, right? So it's not, in addition to meeting, that energy economics challenge, there is also creating a sense of mission, clear messaging to the globe, to investors, but then also a set of aspirational opportunities for young people. And because talent is evenly distributed and opportunity isn't, there's a chance that actually creating this industry in a place like Kenya could attract really outstanding talent that would otherwise have gone to waste to focus on what arguably is one of the most important industries of the remainder of this century.
Yeah, excellent. And before we move from Africa for a moment, I wonder if we've talked a lot about Kenya, some of these factors that we just described because of the physical resources applied throughout the Rift Valley region. But what about Africa more broadly? I know that CAPE is focused on all parts of the continent. Are there other sort of hotspots where you could see DAC taking hold in Africa?
I think DAC will have opportunities in different places. I think the reason why DAC makes particular sense in East Africa is exactly the basalts and the Rift Valley. However, if you take that equation of large amounts of untapped renewable energy and a labor force and other resources, there's a range of ways one could think about it. One of the ones that I'm particularly interested in is as we're thinking about, for example, concrete as an eventual destination for captured CO2. One of the things that's very much in the back of my mind is 40% of the world's new urban construction between now and 2050 is going to be in Africa, because that's how fast the continent's cities, not just the big ones that you know of, the Lagos and Nairobis, but the Kakamegas and Ijebu-Odes are growing. That's a lot of concrete. And if you compare that with lots of available renewable energy and some of the more distributed models that you were alluding to, you could imagine a world where part of the way that we are rethinking the role of urban construction in Africa is not as just a net emitter, as it has historically been, but potentially a net carbon sink if we can, pick the right cement chemistries, be thoughtful about how we manage emissions from the rest of the construction industry, and then think about that huge amount of pending yet to be poured concrete as another resource quite similar to the basalts that I talked about earlier.
I mean, the other place, of course, that is clear is if you ever go to the Gulf of Guinea in the evenings, there's a lot of flaring going on of methane, natural gas flaring. And they have a very unique geology as well, because they've got large salt caverns closer to where the oil industry is. And one of the things that, as a result of the Ukraine-Russia war, is reduced export of nitrogen-based fertilizers into Africa. And you have an opportunity there to capture that flared, rather than flaring the methane, it is converted into ammonia, and then you have a direct stream of carbon dioxide which can be sequestrated into these salt caverns. That way, you have reduced cost of nitrogen-based fertilizers. You have greater production of food. If you can reduce those two, if you can reduce the cost of fertilizer and increase the cost of grain, again, that's a direct win. So these are things that are not currently being spoken about, but for sure give a huge opportunity.
Absolutely. So going to Holly, I'm curious, as someone who's a leading watcher and analyst of how this is all unfolding, particularly socially, like how we actually are going to get this technology into the ground in a way that is fair and optimal. Some of the notes that they just hit about, that are sort of driving the discourse in Africa are starkly contrast, I think, from what we encounter in the U.S. So I'm just kind of curious about your impression of some of the points that James laid out, particularly the lack of competition between renewables and DAC, but rather as an enabler, just from your position as a student of this in the U.S.?
Well, I guess I'll take off my expert hat for a moment and just kind of translate how I think the global climate movement sees this, because I think it's important to address their concerns in communicating it. So I think that, you're looking at luxury emissions, probably, potentially, since we don't have a system for like specifying which emissions should be compensated for by removals, potentially luxury emissions in the global north being absorbed as a waste product in the global south. So that's one concern already. And that's the flip side of the waste management framing we talked about this morning. In a way, people understand recycling, they understand civic responsibility to clean up waste, but there's also huge equity issues with waste as dumping, especially in disadvantaged communities. So that's one concern. The other concern is people look at this and they say, well, can't you use that stranded renewable energy for, could you produce green fertilizer with it? Could you use it for green hydrogen? Could you use it for direct electrification of things? And unless we explain like the fairly wonky issues that you all understand, but I don't even completely understand why you can't use that for other uses, I think that part of it will be maybe dead on arrival from a climate movement standpoint. But I also think that this is playing out on the backdrop of conversations around green hydrogen in Africa and other places. And that's a more mature discussion, and maybe there's some things to learn from how policy and advocacy in that space is going. Because it's a very similar problem to my mind of what should this renewable energy capacity be morally used for, and how do you build up a new industry that isn't just extractive, where there's local training, local capacity, local manufacturing around it.
Yeah. James and Andrew, I'd love actually your response to the two items that Holly just raised, particularly around the perception that this is dumping of waste in the South by the North, and often the term or the meaning of neocolonialism is sometimes evoked by activists on social media to describe that. How do you view that from your position?
So, in some ways, it feels like a really imperfect analogy because carbon dioxide is not like other kinds of waste. Firstly, it's already there, right? So, in a sense, we're not taking CO2 from anywhere and putting it anywhere else. We're basically saying this is already everywhere in massive concentrations or in greater concentrations than are stable for the climate. We are all feeling the impact. So that's a given. It's not like we're bringing something that wasn't already there. The second thing is the process of disposing of it, at least to date, does not seem to have much, if any, kind of major environmental externalities. That needs to be carefully studied. But as industries grow, this is not one, at least certainly the technology that we're talking about, that are necessarily an eyesore or damaging, right? They plug directly in if you're already doing geothermal field exploitation. So in essence, what we are saying is that there's an opportunity for countries that are desperately in need, right? If you think about the economics of a country like Kenya, we are desperately in need of foreign exchange and exports, right? We need competitive exports. The challenge is to be competitive in value-added exports that aren't raw materials, which is where we are typically stuck. You often need a lot of additional infrastructure. This is an industry that begins to generate hard currency dollars for the economy, essentially almost off the bat. The buyers might be luxury industries and so on and so forth, but it is revenue straight into the exchequer that then helps keep the currency stable and so on, in addition to all of the other benefits that we talked about in terms of helping finance the energy system. And as for things like green fertilizer, green hydrogen, absolutely, this is not an either or. We need to deploy all of those. And I think it's fair to say that if Kenya is already building one green ammonia fertilizer plant, or working to get one built and trying to get more done. It's fair to say that if everything that's currently being discussed for even just that one country were to be done exactly as planned, exactly on time, we would be still talking about less than a single-digit percentage of the available renewable energy. And so the message ends up being the biggest thing we can do to help people in the global south is arrest climate change as fast as possible, which means scaling up all of these technologies as quickly as we can and reducing emissions. If they can contribute to that, not just by being passive victims and saying, leave us out of this, but by saying, we have the resources to contribute to this fight. If someone will pay us and give us the livelihoods that we need in order to play, then that shifts the discussion. It's about how do we together work towards a solution instead of, well, we caused it, we're going to try and figure it out over here in ways that actually continue to create negative externalities and do not address the bigger challenge that people in the global south face, which is a lack of jobs and a lack of economic growth opportunities.
Just to add on.
Sorry, I'm really passionate about that.
No, that's great. I wanted you to unleash the passion, as you always do, James. But for Andrew and James, too, just to the second point that Holly referred to about the climate movement and that certain third rails that can cause conflict or disagreement there. But the climate movement is not monolithic, obviously, and it has different formations in different places. So what Holly says is absolutely correct, that there is a lot of pushback along those lines from certain parts of the climate movement. But within the local African, within Kenya, environmental advocates, climate advocates, do you see what you're proposing here as running afoul of some of the priorities or principles that they have in place, or is there alignment?
Maybe I'll take this one, James. Look, it's climate activists are interesting. Again, they're not monolithic. So you have some that are really based at the community level, who may not understand direct air capture, and this is an issue because direct air capture is not like growing trees. It's not like end fossil fuels. It's a bit more nuanced. The technology is nuanced. What happens to it is also nuanced. And the other thing that I hear this discussion sometimes, and it puzzles me, that why are we building direct air capture in Kenya and we have no emissions? Not forgetting that there is no geography when it comes to carbon dioxide. You can be generating it in China, but it's affecting you in Kenya. So we really have to, it's an education process. We have to tell people, listen, this is what's going on. You are going to bear the effects of global warming, whether or not you generated the carbon dioxide. So let's look and see where the energy is, the renewable energy, the negative carbon energy is, and where does the geology allow us to store the carbon dioxide, irrespective of where it was generated. Yeah? So where are the factors just right? And let's invest there. And also, you can't just, okay, I understand that there is carbon capture at source, but generally the carbon dioxide is already out there. So let's see what we can do.
Absolutely. Anything to add to that, James? Or?
No, that was spot on.
I agree. Great. Well, just to shift a little bit between the dynamics between North and South, or between the U.S. and Africa a little bit around siting, and just a couple of points to raise. So obviously the U.S. has jumped out with a gigantic lead and has many competitive advantages when it comes to DAC development. The most ambitious, serious policies that support supply, more legislation introduced to galvanize demand. And ultimately, there are places where DAC developers, companies, and their investors have to look to in order to develop their projects. And right now, the U.S. is making an increasingly strong case for that. So I'm wondering how, from the Kenyan perspective or the African perspective, how do you compete with that suite of factors that the United States is putting forward in order to be able to realize this great Carbon Valley vision?
I'll tell you what we won't be able to do is offer billions of dollars, and Andrew will know this a lot better than I do from his time really trying to drive big things in our energy system in government. What we will not be doing is offering billions of dollars of subsidies and incentives because we don't have them. What we do have is, I think, and this will be true of a number of climate technologies, is that the factors that coincide, the geophysical and sometimes biophysical factors that combine in Africa, offer, from an engineering perspective, the most efficient way to do some of these things at scale. And from a global energy system perspective as well, as in with the lowest number of trade-offs, so that when you start looking at the real fundamental trade-offs that we start wrestling with when we talk about technologies like DAC, that straitjacket, the logic of doing this work in Africa is in part that straitjacket is most relaxed and in some ways completely absent in parts of Africa, is the first thing. The second thing is hopefully as we begin to build levels of domestic alignment and excitement, and Chris, you saw, I think I would put President Ruto up against anyone as probably the head of state that's most informed about some of the intricacies of direct air capture as an industry, because it's a big deal for us. It's a potential opportunity. And so the willingness to really think through what are catalytic policies and so on that are not, financial incentives, but are really kind of accelerating the path in some ways. And some of that might relate to issues such as permitting and so on and so forth, which we do need to work on, but I think it's one of those levers that I think countries like Kenya will be looking to pull. And I think the last thing I would say is there is an element here of the story, the narrative, but then also just the space to kind of have this be, already an industry that's on center stage from day one. In an environment like that, because we can focus on it, because there's very few of these sophisticated industries that have chosen to play in our geography. So those are the things that first come to mind. But boy, it's hard to compete with hard cash. That's for sure. And Andrew, I don't know if there's a few things you could add from your perspective on what we could put on the table.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no competition. From the way I see the big numbers that have been thrown about, it's more about technology development, and we want people to develop the technologies. There was a very interesting comment here that was in one of the first panels that said the automotive engine is the cheapest kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour than any other power plant, and that's because many of them get made. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're doing bespoke kind of stuff. If we can get to that point where we do modular, mass-produced, then it helps everybody. And we look at different kinds of things. Like for example, like on mineralization, you need high pressure, high temperature. You can't do better than actually synthesizing what Mother Nature already does from a volcanic point of view. And there it is in the Rift Valley. The steam that generates geothermal power is coming out at 10 bar and 350 degrees centigrade. And that's natural. You don't have to add any more energy into that. It's already coming out of the ground at that level. It's time for us, once the technology moves sufficiently far enough, to start putting these pilot projects in places like that and see how they can be scaled up.
Absolutely. So just as we wind down here, another question about, thinking about the North and the South and the policy focus in both areas that you would expect is that in places like Kenya, it's about how do you create the most conducive environment to make direct air capture development feasible, while also maintaining, protections socially. So enabling environment where in the North, the source of demand, incentives, putting money into actually making sure that there's a market for that. But rather than thinking about those as artificially separate, I wonder how they can actually link together. And we've talked about this, James, quite a bit, where when you have Finland, for instance, that was the first country in the world, I believe, last year that announced a net negative target, as part of the rationale that was articulated for that was what the North owes the South. In a bill that I've worked on in Luxembourg, of all places, that has embedded within it the idea of favoring projects that are developed and co-owned by project owners in the global south. So I'm wondering, to what degree can the policy making that we do up here, or that we do in the advanced economies, actually create energy and resources and direction to help make it easier to do DAC projects in the global south?
I think exactly as you said, because there's actually a really interesting dynamic here, because if you think about it, abstracted from any of the analogies we bring, the analogy of waste management and so on, the way that we frame this, if we are saying that these are a set of technologies that and again, the research needs to be done to continue to prove this, that have really relatively low negative environmental footprint, are potentially providing a valuable service to the planet, and will be worth, and that service will be worth a lot of money. These are ideal things to invest in the global south. And I think what we should be moving towards is, how do we take that sense of obligation that those who are looking at their own emissions and their wealth from those emissions are feeling, how do we take that obligation and turn it in a positive direction? And that might mean that we're saying, you know what, polluter pays, and pays correctly. So what is the actual social cost of carbon? Can we make those funds available at truly sizable scale, hundreds of billions of dollars, to finance these critical new industries that need to have a home where they can do the most good? How do we get the rules and the regulations to be somewhat agnostic about where the removal is happening, so long as the removal is happening and clearly attributed, and it's being paid for fairly and reasonably? Because that then allows us to combine the investment, the massive investment we need in order to avert the climate catastrophe, with the huge need for investment in order to unlock the economic potential of the global south. Otherwise, we're looking for two pots of money, and I don't think we have two. We may not even have the one that that we're trying to get, right? So if we can make it the same pot, firstly, it stretches further, because I think it'll be cheaper to do a lot of these things in the global south. And it allows us to do two things with the same dollar or euro or pound, which is address climate, while at the same time providing much needed economic stimulus in places where the climate catastrophe is already attacking other sources of economic well-being.
Great. And Holly, just to sort of bring it back, so what James has been laying out, and Andrew, and what I heard in Nairobi and what I see in Africa around, again, the rationale and the energy and the reasons for pursuing CDR and DAC specifically, are very different from what's within the discourse within the climate movement, I would say, within the United States, which understandably is often focused on more local issues and feasibility and who's behind it. But I'm wondering, I'm just curious, as an observer who's very enmeshed in the activist community, as a student and a scholar, these types of arguments that he's making, do you think that is a key to building a bridge, maybe, with people within the climate movement to be able to talk about it in these types of terms and be able to demonstrate it from people who are actually moving things forward in Africa? Do you think that might be a basis for starting a conversation, which has been so hard to start?
Well, I don't want to have the last word be pessimistic, so I guess I'll construct an optimistic answer, which I think is that a lot hinges on this idea that it would only be a small fraction of the renewable capacity there. So there's always this question of the math behind our ideas. And if you don't know that math, if you haven't heard about it, then you're not going to get somewhere. So we need to have deeper discussions. They can't be just, quick take, outrage industrial complex platforms that we're having these conversations. We have to sit down with each other and kind of go through the math, go through alternatives to get on the same page.
Yeah. Agreed. Great. Well, unless anyone has a final thought, we are just winding down to the last few seconds, and I know that we have a panel right after this, but if not, I want to thank the panel. If you could please join me in giving a round of applause. James, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you, folks.